So while we wait for everyone to get started, we actually thought we could start with a quick poll to just get a sense of who's in the room today. So could we actually have the poll up? Just quick show of hands on who's in the room today and what your role's like, just so we get a sense of what the audience is like today. All right, this seems like my favorite kind of room. Lots and lots of data people, it sounds like. We'll give it a minute or two, but 23% analysts, data analysts, 34% data engineers, 33% data leaders, and then the rest business users and modern data stack representatives. So full room of data people. So my favorite kind of room. Awesome. So I think with that, we can actually get started. I just want to start with quickly introducing myself. Hi, I'm Prakalpa. I'm the co-founder of Atlan. For those of you who don't know Atlan, we're pioneering the active metadata category in the modern data stack. What that means is that in practice, we bring your metadata together to create a unified data discovery, cataloging, lineage experience. But instead of just keeping that metadata locked up, we're trying to take that back into the daily workflows and tools that teams are using every day. So for example, when I'm in a dashboard and can I say, when I say, can I trust this or not? Or what does this metric mean? I get that context directly through a Chrome extension rather than having to jump into another tool. Or, when I'm exploring lineage for root cause analysis and I find an issue, I can create a Jira ticket in line directly and send that announcement into Slack. We're a Forrester top right leader in their newest release category of enterprise data catalog for data ops, a Gartner cool vendor in their inaugural data ops category. But most importantly, very, very proud to be powering some amazing data teams, companies like Unilever, Ralph Lauren, Postman, and so on. And, today we're here to talk about one such team and their story. They're a surprisingly small team, just 15 people, supporting 90 data sources and over 1,500 data consumers. They've weathered a ton of storms, built and rebuilt. And personally, I think it's been one of the most inspiring journeys that I've had a chance to witness. And so without further ado, extremely excited to welcome Harold, the head of data engineering at WeWork, and Emily, the data product architect, and really the driving force behind the data culture at WeWork. So welcome on board, Harold and Emily, and over to you.
Hi, my name is Emily, and I've been at WeWork for 5 years now. You'll hear a lot more from me a little bit later on, so I'll pass it over to Harold so that he can introduce himself now.
Thanks, Emily, and thank you for Prakalpa, and thank you all for joining. Hope this is going to be informative and fun and exciting, because we're excited about the work that the team has done and the work that we've been doing with the Atlan team. And let's see how this goes, and please make sure to keep interactive with us and answer the poll questions. Feel free to pop in questions or comments in the chat, and let's make this a fun conversation for everyone. And so, hi, I'm Harel. I have been leading the data engineering team at WeWork for the past 2 years. Prior to that, I was working on the data platform team at WeWork. So I've overall been here for 4 years. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some parts of our journey, and then I'm going to pass it over to Emily to go into the interesting details that you all came here to learn. And so before we do that, if you can jump into the next slide, Emily, I'm going to give a brief intro to WeWork. So for those of you who haven't heard about WeWork, go watch the documentary or the series on Apple TV, and you'll find out. No, I'm kidding. So WeWork was founded in 2010 with a vision to create environments where people and companies can come together and do their best work. And since then, WeWork's become one of the leading global flexible space providers, committed to delivering technology-driven turnkey solution for flexible spaces, community experiences. And so kind of the core business of WeWork, we have the space as a service, which is kind of the traditional WeWork office space that people know. And then we also have the kind of access and on-demand products that allow for more flexible use cases for teams looking for office space. This is especially picked up due to the recent changes in the workplace and how things are looking across the globe. And then an exciting thing that we just launched this week is WeWork Workplace, which is a partnership with ERD in building software and tooling to help essentially people across the globe manage their workplaces. And so check it out if you're interested, but that's all I'm gonna do in talking about WeWork in that aspect. And I'm gonna go back to the thing you all joined to tune into, which is data. And so, all right, so I'm gonna start with a preamble of kind of things we're hearing on Slack. So I'm going to quote some of these because they're, I'm sure you all relate to these at some point in your data journeys at different teams and companies. And so, things on Slack like this data is so dirty and it just doesn't make sense. Where is it coming from? What's the source system? Wait, how do we even know how many enterprise accounts we have if we can't agree on what the definition of enterprise account is? Or just the random, I need to do some digging, give me access to more data. And my personal favorite, which is completely made up, I did the calculations with my abacus and I have a different number. No one ever said that, but it's a fun quote. This quickly turns into the game of whose turn is it to cry, right? Because some days it's the rest of the company and our stakeholders, and other days it's us with all the different things that are happening. And so we had to do something, right? But before we talk about what we had to do and kind of our journey, let's give a bit of background on how did this happen and how do we get to this moment. And so the journey begins in 2010, as I describe it, and WeWork was building and growing very, very rapidly. We're opening buildings, and by 2017 we were opening a building a day globally, which is incredible pace of doing that. And then in order to keep up with all these building openings and keeping up with all the members that are joining and everyone coming in, we worked and the team really invested in building a lot of software and a lot of technology, and some of them, working with other partners in the industry, and some of the things were built in-house inside the team because we couldn't find the things that we needed for the massive scale that we were experiencing. So around 2018, which is the time when I joined WeWork, the engineering part of the organization was structured in a way to support these various initiatives that were going on. So we were kind of adopting a mission-based organization where we had product-driven teams that were, they had full autonomy to go and deliver on business priorities. So be it, real estate, software and business priorities, and our sales and marketing, billing and payments, really across the board. And so, we're creating a scalable structure that could support the rapid growth that we were expecting, because also if you think about it, we were growing from, when I joined, we were around 300 people. We were growing to 2,000 people over the course of 2 years, which is really massive growth in the projections. And so we built the scalable structure that enabled autonomy, but then we also built platform teams to support this as we knew we were going to grow and grow bigger. And so I was part of the platform team supporting essentially the data platform for the entire company. And then, we were kind of building this organization and building internal tools. During 2018 and going to 2019, we were kind of getting a handle of things. We were building internal tools like, for example, Marquez. So, making investments in data. And for those of you who don't know, Marquez is an open source data lineage tool that was open sourced by WeWork. Now it's part of the Linux Foundation, LFAI. So, welcome to go check it out. The industry has adopted it. And actually, there's a new spin-off of it called Open Lineage, and it's kind of picking up in various places. So, that's also our contribution, and it also helps understand the mindset that our team had at that time of the importance of data and the importance of really tracking data and helping on the operational side of things. And so we're looking like we're going the right places, right? And so something happened in 2019, and that's we were trying to go public, and that didn't really go so well. And so 2020, not only did we have our plans to go public kind of failed, also COVID started happening, and the impact on office space and the impact on our core business, really forced the company to make really really difficult decisions. And as we were going through them, this is kind of the impetus to this story and what we want to talk about. So to take a few breaths and help us, calm down and settle. So let's reflect for a second, right? So we were building this massive growth, and in this massive growth, we were now shrinking because we had to, do the right thing for the company. And so we still had all the different products and users that we wanted to support, but our team to support all those things, which was a much smaller team. And so we kind of really had to think about what we're doing, right? And so, yes, the Sesame Street gifts are great. Thank you for saying that, and thanks for and with the Sesame Street spirit. I love that we're making this a bit interactive here. Let's talk a little bit about kind of like the challenges we were facing, taking into account the perspectives that we just talked about, right? So we were thinking about the biggest challenge is rebuilding trust, right? So we had a team that just suffered massive exits and people coming in and out and teams reshuffling and restructuring. And so, how do you trust that this team is here to stay, right? And the people you work with are going to work with you the next day, and the stakeholders that you work with are going to work with you the next day. And so, it's really super challenging to rebuild that trust. And then the second challenge is, we had a lot of internal tools we were building for a much larger organization and company. But now we're a much smaller team and much smaller organization, and we really needed to take control over our technology and our platform and the cost incurred by all these things. And so let's take a quick poll, and if you could all talk about what is the biggest challenge faced by your data teams right now, would be super interesting to see that. And so I don't think I can see the poll results, but maybe Prakalpa, if you can, would be great to see what people are saying.
So it seems interestingly evened out between, we have the team stuck in reactive mode, a lot of that actually, 33%, creating great data culture, 29%. I'm just gonna give it actually a couple of seconds before, maybe we'll give it like another 10 seconds before we end the poll and share the results.
Thank you all for participating too.
Yeah, well, it seems pretty even along the board. 31%, like great data culture and team stuck in reactive mode, followed by ad hoc service requests and not enough trust in the data. So,
all right,
well,
sounds like
sounds like the day in our lives.
Yep. So hopefully in the next section, we'll talk about, we'll give some tips on the culture side, give some tips on like the product mindset of thinking about data. And so let's get back to our story a little bit. So let's kind of jump back to where we are, right? So taking stock of all the things that we had. So, I mentioned we were building a lot of things and not all of them made sense. And so we're kind of looking at the things that did make sense for us, right? So we had a pretty kind of like quote unquote modern data stack in the regards of, we're using vendors that could manage a lot of our kind of extract and load pipelines. But then also we had our own custom rollout of dbt that was running on top of Airflow. We're using Snowflake. Most of our data is fairly structured and fairly modeled in a good way. That's thanks to the work that the team has done also before I joined the team when all the changes happened. And so, we had really good foundations in terms of the stack that we had and the data products that we had built before. But we also needed to support them, right? So we kind of needed to reshuffle a little bit. What was the previous org structure? What is the new one? What makes sense? What kind of engagement relationships we want to have with the different stakeholders across the org, because we were going through things, they were going through things as well, and so there was kind of a shared empathy here of all the changes. And so the first step was really about rebuilding ownership. So both with the data models that we supported, so our product, right, the core products of what we're here for. So we kind of reassigned ownership of all the different data models and all the different products that we had for different teams. We created new collaboration patterns, also to kind of proliferate knowledge sharing. We completely revamped the team and internal team processes. So, things from planning to retros and just how we do the work, right? So think of it as though you're in a month kind of hiring from 0 to 15 and building a whole team from scratch, because not everyone used to work together before that. And so also rebuilding relationships. So there we could kind of lean on some of the existing relationships and some of the people that used to work together, but we had to build on top of that and build new relationships. And so that was kind of the first step. And in tandem, we also really reduced the amount of data platforms that we maintained, right? Because not all of them made sense. And most of the workflows that we were supporting before were not necessarily relevant for what the company was doing at this point. And also, as you can imagine, thinking about budgets and what's critical and what's not critical, we're also looking at cutting down costs where we could to help the company and help the bottom line and kind of, help with the turnaround story of WeWork. And as you can imagine, there's quite a lot of migration work involved in it. And, no one really loves doing migration work, but when you get why you're doing it, it makes sense. So, at this point, we're more or less 6 months into the future from where I was talking about here. We rebuilt the processes, we're re-owning the stack and the platform. And then we got to a place where okay, we feel pretty good. And now is the time where we can actually start reinvesting and, thinking about new priorities. And so we invested to gain our users' trust. So we really wanted to optimize for how we can get our users to understand the data more. And this is kind of where, if you remember the Slack messages that we had at the beginning of the webinar, that's kind of where we're meeting this point again, right? So people were not trusting the data that they were seeing. People were not trusting that they're seeing the right numbers and they're seeing the right definitions. But we also knew we can't scale the team to support more users. So we needed to think about solutions that will help us scale without increasing our costs. At the same time, also, we're doing a lot of work and we deserve to get some things for ourselves to make our work easier and more fun. And so we were also prioritizing for ourselves. We're kind of thinking about tooling, right? And we were thinking about tools that will help us with things like data discoverability, right? Because people weren't finding the right data they were looking for. Data lineage, as I mentioned earlier with Marquez, we knew that tracking lineage and where data comes from and kind of using that as a tool to drive, there's things around your core operations, but also to drive trust with data. So that was a key kind of feature we were looking for. We were also investing a lot in our existing stack and in our DBT documentation and modeling. And so we wanted a tool, or we wanted a platform to help us kind of leverage that and make that more public, but also enable people across the organization to help contribute to our shared goals of, finding the right data and understanding the right data. And also at the same time, we knew we were going public again. And so compliance was also important for us. And we wanted a tool that will help us with some of these goals. And so a few kind of process tips and that I can share in the middle is involving the partner teams from the ideation phase of, hey, we're looking at introducing a new tool to help us with these things. Hey, can you maybe tell us what you're looking for and what makes sense to you? And secondly is, create a matrix that tries to capture most of the things. So your team's needs, your users' needs, and kind of make informed decisions. And the reason why we're talking here is, if we go to the next slide, we actually is because we chose Atlan as that tool. And so far, it's been a really great partnership. And thanks to Kalpa and the rest of the Atlan team for being great partners, because this is something that we always say between us. We didn't choose a vendor, we chose a partner to go with us. And we're very happy about that. And so if we go on to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about the road to implementation. And this is where I actually pass it on to Emily, and she's going to give some really insightful tips and really the interesting part of this webinar, to be honest. But before I go there, so the road to implementation included 2 aspects, and I think that's the biggest takeaway that we want you to remember from this webinar, and that's you need to invest in tools and platforms, and integrate all the data that you have and leverage all the existing glossaries, try to centralize in one place, automate as much as possible if the tool that you're implementing has APIs, and also define a very clear POC on a use case. In our case, it was public API governance and kind of helping. So we knew that was super critical for us. So we were kind of finding a use case that will push us to implement and leverage that using the platform and product that we're choosing. And then the other side, which is not less important at all, is really investing in a person to own the cultural aspect of the deployment. And I'm not going to talk through much here because I think Emily is going to do a much greater job at talking through all these, because she is the person who owned the cultural aspect of the deployment. And so thank you for putting in questions. I think we're going to kind of ingest some of the data, we'll transform it, and we'll deliver it back to you towards the end of the Q&A session. So I'll pass it on to Em.
Thanks, Harel, and thanks Kalpa for having us here, and thanks Atlan for being such a great partner through all of this. Hi, my name is Emily. I joined the Central Data team about a year ago. A little bit about my background. I started my career as a librarian, and while I was obtaining my master's degree in library information science, I learned about classification and metadata. I worked in libraries for several years, and then through a series of fortunate events, I got a job at WeWork as an information architect. And then working with and organizing information, I started dabbling with data more and more until it really just made sense for me to move over to the central data engineering team and work more closely with the rest of the team. Young was my data engineering counterpart who I partnered with for the implementation of Atlan. He just left WeWork, but he'd been here for 3 years. So he knows the data inside and out because he worked on platform and tooling for most of it. Young was the go-to guy for any question that anybody had about data. He created access policies for Snowflake and Tableau. So we were able to use those same for Atlan as well. And honestly, this would not have been possible without this partnership. So that calls for a poll. If you do have a data culture person, do they have someone to partner with? I see some answers coming in live time. This is incredible. This is so cool. There's a lot of yeses, which is great, but there's also a lot of no's. Where that where the split is somewhat even with a lean towards yes more. 56% yes, 44% no. All right. It is really important to have that partnership and work together. So yeah, just figure that out. All right. So first things first, before we made too many moves, we wanted to know what direction we should be moving in. So we needed to get to know our data friends better. And our data friends were the people that use data, but are not on the central data engineering team. We sent out a survey to the 441 Snowflake users to find out a little bit more about their habits when it came to data. We asked what they use data for, why they need data, how easy is it for them to find what they're looking for, how often do they get stuck, do they trust the data, and if they don't trust the data, why? Like really easy breezy questions. So here's a poll question coming at you right now. When was the last time you asked people for feedback on data in your company? I love the answer. Never. We're supposed to talk about data. We don't talk about data. A lot of people within the past month have talked to their company about data. This is great. Some within the past year, some it's been longer. Good mix coming in right here. So some of these questions that we asked they were simple radio button replies, and then others were free text responses. And these free text responses were important because when reviewing the results, I looked over all of those free text questions and paid attention to people who were particularly verbose and whose responses had a lot of feelings in them, especially negative feelings, because I wanted to know the issues, not necessarily because I thought we could fix every single issue that everyone had, but I did want to learn about things that we could potentially fix. And also, I just wanted them to know that we were open to hearing what they had to say. Sometimes just that act of opening the door for a conversation, even if the conversation doesn't wind up with a perfect solution, that can help to build a better relationship. The last thing that I looked for was a yes to a question that I added at the end of the survey, asking if they would be open to a 25-minute follow-up conversation so that we could learn more from them. And we've got an interactive question for you now. What stops you from getting feedback from people in your company if you're not currently getting feedback about your data? And the poll is live. A lot of people don't have bandwidth to do this, which makes a lot of sense. They give us unsolicited positive feedback all the time. That's incredible. What company are you? You should be teaching this right now.
I think a follow-up question to nobody in our team has bandwidth to do this should be like, you need an Emily in your team. Do you have an Emily in your team?
100%.
Oh, thanks, guys. So we got mixed. I'm afraid they might say some negative things, like 5%. They give unsolicited positive feedback all the time, 11%. I didn't even think about it, 8%. I wouldn't know where to start, 24%, and nobody on our team has the bandwidth, 51%, right? And that's part of having like a dedicated person to help with this and help in this role and everything. So back to the presentation. When I go in for a follow-up conversation, there are a few things that I make sure that I have. I put together all of the communications that I'm going to send out via different channels regarding this conversation in the same place. And this is so that I can make sure that I'm using all the same language every time I talk about this follow-up conversation. And by constructing these messages before I send them out, I can like automate my comms a little bit with a quick copy and paste to different people. Make sure that I include all the pertinent information the other person needs as well, so that we can both be prepared to have a really productive conversation. The second thing is I make sure that I include my intentions and the main thing that I want to learn from them coming away from this conversation. And then 3, if there's any information that they provided to me beforehand, I make sure that I'm easily able to review and reference that during our conversation. They already took the time to fill out that survey, and so I want to be mindful of that. You can see here that I've created a sort of like Mad Libs for myself where I have a statement or a question, and then I leave space to refer to what they had said in the initial survey. And then this is super important. When I go to have this conversation, I make sure that I'm in a place where I won't be disturbed, because although I have these questions and thoughts written down, I really want the other person to lead the conversation and talk about the things that are on their mind. You can think of it kind of like bowling. The goal is to hit some pins at the end of the alley. The person is going to roll the ball, and your questions are like the bumpers, making sure that the ball gets down to the pins. If they stray too far off topic, you can use your questions to bring them back in, but ultimately, you're here to listen to what they have to say. Okay, so then when I do have this conversation with our data friends, I take notes and I share my screen so that they can see that I'm paying attention to what they have to say. And that, like, if I get caught on something, I'm typing, and I'm like a little behind what they're saying, they can see that and they can help me figure it out. Taking notes is important, so that way you can make sense of all the different conversations that you have later on as well. When I take these notes, I like to do so using an online whiteboarding software and these little virtual Post-it notes. Post-it notes are great because it forces me to keep like one thought per note. And when reviewing later and synthesizing, it's easier to move little notes around into groups of similar sentiments. So you want to look for patterns in what's being said across all the people that you chat with. Okay. So after listening to our data friends, I need to bring what's been learned back to the central data engineering team so that we could all get buy in and really be on the same page. So I took those themes from my virtual whiteboard, some interesting quotes people said during our convos, some of their free text responses, and the multiple choice answers from the initial survey. And I put this all into a deck to tell a little story. This is where like my librarian background kind of comes into play here. Here we can see that I pulled out the fact that when people are looking for data, they only go to DBT, which is where our documentation is held. That should give all the context and provide a deeper understanding of the data in general, 8% of the time. And here you can see a quote from someone saying that they're trying to learn SQL, like they're really trying, but they're still having a hard time because they didn't build out the models and they don't know exactly where to look or even where to start. So I wanted to show that we weren't making it terribly easy for our data friends. The barrier to entry was too high and people were getting disheartened. So with this new insight into the struggle of our data friends, we now had a newfound empathy for our data friends. And we knew that we needed to help, but how and where? Well, to figure that out, we had a workshop. We took those things that our data friends said were issues and we grouped them into themes. You can see here that people want to know where the data is coming from. With more than 150 source systems at WeWork, this is a question that everyone asks a lot. So we grouped these sentiments together and gave it a little title of source information. They also want some way to know that when they do find the data, that it is in fact like the data, it's the right data. So we had a scorecard that we created and we all filled it out together. And we considered effort, automatability, impact, time, and priority to figure out what features we should prioritize. We had another workshop with Atlan where they helped us to think about data as a product instead of a service. And we were all brainstorming together, writing things down, having an open conversation. The most important thing about all of this was that we did it together as a team. Everyone was there, everyone participated, and everyone had a chance to ask questions and share their hopes and fears. And with that, I mean, we did the prioritization thing. We talked about it. It was time to just do it. We just had to jump in. We just had to get started, right? So we started with what we knew we needed because of what our data friends told us. They want to know that they're using the right assets. So we plugged away and made sure to provide our assets with certificates. When you have so many assets, it can be overwhelming though. So tip, like start at the database level and then you can kind of like work through your schemas and down from there. We are trying to get down to the table level. And that's something that we're going to be tackling during our new bi-weekly team documentation hour, which is too much to talk about this time around, but we'll touch more on that another time. And the other thing our data friends talked about was wanting to know sources. So we made sure that lineage was up and running in Atlan. Jan worked on our DBT and Airflow connections so Atlan could parse our SQL and properly display that lineage. Working on what is needed is good, but also make sure that you're working on things that bring you joy and excite you. So I studied English in undergrad, and I've always been really fascinated by words and their meanings. I remember the first time that I realized that language was a bit of a problem for WeWork. I was in a conversation with two different people who were using the same word to talk about two different things. One was talking about a member as an individual person, and the other was talking about a member as a company. Discrepancies like this can have consequences. So I'd been collecting terms and definitions in a spreadsheet since I started WeWork, and Atlan's glossary provides a perfect place to house them all. We also use the glossary to define and keep track of our public KPIs. And this is great because we can link them directly to the assets that these metrics are coming from for additional context and alignment. So after we got some of these features up and running, we wanted a fun way to bring it back to our data friends because fun things are fun. So we created a data personality quiz, which was kind of a play on a dating personality quiz. We asked people questions like, when your data results differ from what you expected, what do you do? Cry, try to investigate, but then get stuck and then cry, or dig deeper and SQL harder until it makes sense. Depending on their answers, we would let them know if they were data disinterested, data interested, data skeptical, data adjacent, or data confident. From there, people who are interested, skeptical, or adjacent were given some suggestions on how they could take their relationship with data to the next level. One of those ways was education. We created a course to help our data friends understand the fundamentals of data, starting with the very simple question of what is data. We talked about our ecosystem, our team structure, and how to best work with the central data team. We wanted our data friends to feel more empowered to explore on their own. We also wanted them to know that it was okay to be confused or intimidating. At the end of the course, we had them create accounts for Atlan and Tableau and showed them how to use both and gave them a sticker with our mascot data bot. Because if you don't have a mascot, is it even real? I don't know. So how's it going? It's a journey. So like you're never really done, but we are progressing. We keep a line of communication open with our data friends. We've created ways for friends to continue learning on their own, like demo videos that we've posted on our intranet. We currently have an initiative going where we're partnering with teams to help them build out collections of saved queries that are important to them. Pro tip, go to the person on a team who's like the most excited from the beginning, or pick one person and help them get excited and then get them on board so that they can help get the rest of the team on board. Having a partner in a team like really makes it easier. So make a big data best friend. The biggest thing is that we're trying to meet people where they are and make it easier for them to data however they need to data. And yes, I use data as a verb just now. So some learnings from our journey, get stakeholders involved in the beginning and in the planning process from the beginning. And while you're doing that, make sure that you're sharing how your journey is going, especially things that don't go so well. The common language is very, very important. You can't have shared understanding without the same language. And after launching it, that's not the end of it. You got to keep going with it. You got to keep bringing it out to people, focus on adoption and engagement as well, and lean on your community to really help you with everything. And that is it. I think we have one more question here. This is an interactive question, so you can use this QR code to access it via your phone, or I have a I can plop this in the chat as well. People should be able to access it there. It's a free text one. And it's if you created a mascot for your data team, what would it be and what would your mascot be called? There we go. I've been able to plop it in the chat there. Databot Jedi. And we're going to word cloud this so that way we can see the most popular answers and everything. I think we're going to.
I like data doggy.
Jedi, Aardvark, B.
Emily, do you want to try sharing your screen for the Slido?
Yes, let me stop this share and start a new one. There we go. We can see answers coming in. Oh, we got more for Jada Doggy.
This is so cool.
I love this.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Emily and Harold. And there are a ton of questions. So while we wait for while we keep building the wall of mascots for the data team, so please, as you're thinking about it, please add in like a note. This would be like really cool, and we'll share it after with everyone. We'll actually just open it up to an AMA, and we'll try and start picking some key questions that they're coming to Harold and Emily, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible. So I've been tracking a couple of questions, and maybe I'll actually just start going back into the journey itself. Harold, this one's for you, and this one's a little bit related to that decision in terms of build versus buy that you were making internally. And so I think some of the questions that came your way were, how did you think about the reducing proprietary frameworks? How did you balance build versus buy? Competitive advantage versus delivery? Given you already had Marquez for data lineage, how would you compare it with Atlan? And again, related with the topic of lineage, which I know you're very, very passionate about, who takes ownership of creating and maintaining lineage?
Really great questions. Don't even know where to start from, but I'll start from the build versus buy decision, right? So, and this is our team's perspective, right? And every team may have their own perspective, but for us, it was more of a question of like, okay, what's WeWork's secret sauce? What's going to make our business more successful? And if maintaining this type of platform or tool in-house is what's going to make the difference for us, then yes, it makes sense to invest in building because that's, we know we need it. We know that we don't want to necessarily maybe be kind of dependent on a specific vendor for this because we want to have our own customization. And also, is there a vendor out there? And is there a tool out there that we could use off the shelf that will kind of give us what we need, right? So that's kind of the mindset of the build versus buy. And of course, there's also the cost effectiveness and thinking about your company's data scale and yeah, so super challenging process to go through. The only thing I can say is you probably have super smart people on your team. So get together and talk about it and make it an open conversation and everything's on the table and nothing's taboo to talk about. And then you get to the results eventually, right? Let's take the lineage part of the question, which is interesting. So, Marquez, as a philosophy of collecting lineage is more of a philosophy of, collect the lineage when the creation of data is happening, right? And there are a lot of benefits to doing that because you have all the context of why you're creating the data right now and how you're creating it. But we're such a small team compared to what we were before, and we had a lot of different company priorities to worry about. And Marquez was, we were building it, but it wasn't there in a space where it could address all our needs, also from like a usability perspective. And so, we needed the industry and the open source community to spend more time in building it. And so at that point of time, it didn't make sense for our team to use it, even though we really believe in it, right? And so in that sense, the difference between how that works versus how Atlan's lineage tracking works, and Brucalba, please feel free to jump in and give your perspective on it as the builder of the thing. it's more in retrospect, right? Like looking at what happened and looking at hindsight and saying, oh, these queries ran, and here are all the DBT models that you're running, and I'm going to ingest all the manifest files to look at the relationships. I'm going to look at query history. And so you have a kind of like rear view mirror picture of everything that's happened. And the good thing about that is that you don't have to put in the work to, to actively do that. It is triggered for you by another platform. So there's like pros and cons to either approaches. I think in the future, as an industry, we're going to move to collecting metadata more and more and lean on open standards. And I'm sure we're going to see more improvements across the board there. So yeah, Prakalpa, do you want to add on anything to that?
Yeah, no, I think you covered it. I think, the way I would think about lineage is there's like the way we think about it is that we have a fully base open platform with the hope that as much as possible, you want your core metadata and lineage to start getting exposed from the core tools in the stack itself. So you're already starting to see this with Fivetran recently released a metadata API, which directly sends in sort of metadata, which helps you construct lineage. And Databricks recently released this with their Unity catalog. So I think there's some element of that where the industry itself is going to start opening up metadata. But while we get there as an industry, I think it's important to still have your end-to-end lineage map. And so, for example, what we do is we read through query parsing through your query logs. I think there were some questions around that with Snowflake. So we read through your query logs in Snowflake to auto-construct column level lineage. We read through DBT manifest files, which allow us to construct column level lineage across several projects and DBT, pieces like that, which actually create sort of that end-to-end lineage across tooling.
And I think on that, there was another question on like the instrumentation of how Atlan instruments Airflow and DBT. And so I think it's kind of like in the same ballpark of question. So, Atlan will basically read your DBT manifest files and pull that into the complete picture, so like documentation and connect the dots between your assets on, if you're using Snowflake, and your assets on Snowflake or your warehouse, or whatever storage you use. And so that part works that way. And for Airflow, you can extend using the Atlan API, and you can kind of push proactively metadata. So you can define your own proprietary business metadata within the Atlan platform. And then within Airflow, when we trigger a DAG, we kind of send that metadata over, and then that gets connected to those assets within Atlan.
Awesome. Actually, on that thread, Harold, it might be useful, I think, for everyone to hear your perspective. I think there were some questions on how does Atlan complement DBT and GE and other tools. And, DBT already internally has like a data catalog and some data lineage. So at what point does it make sense to bring on a tool like Atlan? So I think it would be useful for folks to hear your perspective on that.
So I think two aspects here. So one is, when we were using DBT, we're not using DBT Cloud, we're using DBT Core, the open source, right? And if you think about that, and if you've used DBT's data dictionary, it's not really a nice thing you can give your business users, because they're just gonna look at you and say, what? And so, it's not super useful for a lot of users, right? Just because of the UI and the experience for users. But then I think the other part where, and maybe if Emily wants to add on here as well, is that, the self-service aspect, right? So if only the people who write DBT have the ability to add documentation, you're kind of bottlenecking your ability to add documentation. And with Atlan, you can complement between the two sides, and then maybe things can bubble up. You're like, oh, my business users are actually using this data this way. And so I'm kind of learning new things about how the business is using it. Emily, from your perspective, like how people are, collaborating and contributing to the definitions, anything you want to add?
I'm typing answers to some of the questions in the chat here, but and I was actually just answering a question about the glossary. I've been collecting terms. I just ask people, like when people say words that I'm unsure of, I ask them, what do you mean when you say that? Or, any project that we're working on, I ask individual teams like, hey, do you have a list of words that you use, like with definitions and everything? I hope that was the question that you were asking.
Actually, on that note, Emily, maybe it would be helpful. I can see a ton of questions around actually just like challenges of bringing people together as people think about sort of like, so I can see some questions around a challenge for us is to find data owners of the different assets, and how do we, enable them and convince them to keep their data assets documented, or how do you define data owners by itself is a topic of conversation. And how have you managed sort of creation, maintenance of data asset definitions, who's responsible for them? So it would be helpful to think about that construct, I think, from an org perspective, and how you're defining ownership, expertise, and getting the broader community to contribute.
Yeah, so I mentioned that we're starting a new documentation hour. Right now, the only owners that we have is collectively like our central data team for the assets that we've managed. And we are talking about ways and how to bring in, okay, so if product is more of an owner for this asset, because it's coming from a source system and they're more intimately acquainted with it, how can we get them to be an owner? And I think it's a matter of getting them onboarded into Atlan, right? And then having those conversations with people too, because really that's the only way. And we're doing a little gamification, giving out some points for people that do the most documentation and everything, trying to get that going. But it is another thing that we're doing, as well as we're doing some like custom demos for different teams, finding out what is important to them, what are their data needs, and then really bringing the product back to them and showing them how Atlan can help them. So I think it's getting people excited about things, and showing them how this can actually help them, not just as a general idea, like making it very applicable and useful to them.
Sorry, I can also see some questions around just the team structures, like data engineering, data platform team, like, how did the team get structured? Do you have, I think there's some around, do you have analytics engineers? So maybe it would be helpful to like actually just talk about the way you thought about structuring the team and creating different roles in the data team, and then how does that interact with the broader organization?
Super interesting. I don't know that there was, we kind of we're rebuilding the org as we were still working and figuring out what to happen. And so previously, before all the changes that happened 2 years ago, we did have a very more of a delineation between the data engineering team and what the data engineering team does, and the data platform team. So, kind of the data platform was mostly building the platform, not just for the data engineers and analytics engineers, but also for software engineers. So, anything that's powering the movement of data within the company, all the way from like ingestion and compute and storage and the infrastructure for those things. So that was a bit of a different mindset. And then when WeWork's needs and kind of when the business priorities shifted, I think that's where we moved to a place where there wasn't really a super strong distinction between, on the data engineering team, we just had data engineers that were sometimes doing modeling work and sometimes going into the platform work and sometimes, writing, Airflow operators to help with their tooling. So, we're kind of hopping back and forth, and we like that structure because it with the amount of resources we had and all the work that we needed to do it, and it enabled our team flexibility. And also at the same time, we were just, a happy group of people collaborating and kind of giving teams and engineers more autonomy to go in different directions. So I think that's why we made that change. I'm hoping that answered the question more or less.
There's a question from Larissa, and this one's about your preparation for public reporting. And like her question is, could you describe your prep to public reporting in more details? And, maybe you want to deep dive a little bit more on what that means from a data perspective and what you had to prep for.
Oh my God. So Yeah, I mean, for public reporting, there's a bunch of things that you need to do, right? There's like acronyms that I can't recite by heart right now, but basically we needed to make sure that anything we report out to the public is coming from a pipeline that is end-to-end SOX, right? So like no one can go in and change numbers by hand in a production system, and no one can manipulate the transformation of building the data model that is feeding numbers, and all the source systems can be trusted. And so for that, you kind of need this whole mapping of lineage, and you need the sense of, I can give the compliance team, they can look at the end table of all the core public APIs that we're reporting on, and they can look at the lineage DAG and the lineage graph, and they can go all the way upstream and go system by system and say, oh yes, this system is okay to feed into a metric that we're reporting on publicly. And so, that was a big part of the process. But I think, I don't know if that's, for every company is the same way or different. That's beyond me to comment on. I'm not a compliance person.
There's an interesting one from Emily. Emily, could you summarize the major milestones, like such as identifying stakeholders, getting their input, like in the cultural journey that you reviewed? Like, what are the key milestones in that journey?
Okay, let's see. So I think first it was me getting excited about Atlan in and of itself, right? So the fact that I'm excited about Atlan, now I can share this excitement with everybody else. And then, yeah, there was a matter of you have to get enough information in there to share it out to other people, right? So we started with those things that our data friends said were important to them, because if we just show them this blank tool that doesn't help them, then they're not excited about it. So we made sure we had that verification in there. We made sure we had a pretty good glossary. We had the lineage up and running. We had those things, and worked on those features that we knew were important. And then it's sharing it out to other people as well. How did I identify stakeholders? I went into Workday and I literally looked at an org chart and I picked people that were at a manager level, and then I just kind of went down the line from there, honestly. And I've been at WeWork for almost 5 years now, so I do know a decent amount of people, and I talk a lot. So I would just talk to people, and anyone who is excited, I would put things on blast in Slack channels. I would send out email messages to the entire org, and just see who wanted to give me the time of day. And anyone that wanted to give me the time of day, I took advantage of it. The initial survey that we sent out, it was literally just every single user in Snowflake. And then from there, I was able to see who wanted to talk to me more. While I looked through those answers, I definitely did make sure that I had a variety of different titles that people had, different tenure that people had, different problems that people had. So that way I could get an overview. And I didn't talk to all 441 people. I talked to probably around 15 or so. And when you talk to people, you want to talk to enough people until you're starting to hear patterns and you're starting to hear some of the same issues that they're saying. And that's pretty good. That wasn't in order at all. But I think I touched on the milestones and the important things. I'm much better when I write things down and then I can organize my thoughts and read them. I'm not as good live.
She's deprecating herself.
Yeah. Yeah, that was pretty structured, Emily, but we will make sure you do a ton of follow-up masterclasses. It seems like there are already a couple of requests. I can see some on the data survey template and things like that. So maybe we'll put out some more of this as follow-ups as well, if possible. Some interesting questions that I'm seeing are also on things like the glossary itself. How are you using the glossary? But I think it would be useful to actually not just talk about how you're using the glossary, but how you've structured the glossary, and even like guidelines and things like that you built out, which I know was a very interesting library sciences kind of way of thinking about data, which is not normal. So I think it would be useful for everyone if you touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So when I am interested in taxonomy, which is different from taxidermy. It's not stuffing dead animals. It's just the organization and classification of information, and essentially it's putting information into groups. Like at the most base level, that's what it is, right? So you want to think about the terms that are in your organization, the words that are there in terms of groups. And I did create like rules and guidelines for filling out the glossary and creating new terms and everything. And like I said, like I initially had just like a bunch of terms that I had collected, from just like hearing different people talk and just in different meetings and everything. I'd previously been on the design team as an information architect. So I worked with a bunch of different teams, and each team that I worked with, they had their own language that they used that I had to learn, like when I would come in and work on these projects. And so I would write these things down and everything. And then having that list, just putting it into categories, right? So my rule was glossaries had to be plural, because a glossary was a collection of terms, and then like individual terms had to be singular, and that, definitions could not include like the word itself. Like that's a pretty standard rule though, right? And then just thinking about how those different terms relate together. So we have one glossary around like products, and then we have another around like memberships. And were those the same thing? Were those different things? They are different, and how do we relate those two? And making sure that we do create connections. Like the ability to create relationships and connections with terms is really, really great within Atlan. And that's kind of how you start to build it. I don't know. I think like a spider web, right? Like it's just like how all of these different things connect together, and building out like a mind map. It might help to actually like do a little like whiteboarding and have your glossaries, your individual glossaries as circles, and like draw lines between them, and define your relationships between them, and figure out how they do relate, if there are relationships between them. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Emily. One question that has a ton of likes, which is, I think, an interesting one. How do you measure the impact of using data governance, and any metrics, or like how do you in general think about measuring the impact of something like this?
So I'd give a few tactical things, but Emily is actually working on improving what we're doing there right now. So I'll let her, I think, talk about this more. But like, if one thing I will say is make sure that you come up with the measurements ahead of time before you start, and ask the questions that will give you this data, and then track as you move forward, because you might get biased along the way, and you want to stay true and honest to where you started from. And so, there are things you can do, like, just product analytics, and measuring engagement with a tool, right? That's the baseline. But there are more qualitative things you can do to ask your users. And I think Emily might want to add here.
For sure. Some on qualitative, something like the behavioral metrics that we are tracking that are important to us is just the total number of Atlan users, right? Like if people aren't using it, then it's not working, right? So then there's like the top five most searched terms, like making sure that those are available and accessible, and that those are properly linked out to the assets that they need to be, and like the other terms and everything. Then there's, the top 10 most active users, and then you can use that information to talk to them, reach out to them and see like, okay, how are you using this product? What are the things that are working? What are the things that are not working? Another one is top 5 most used features, like to figure out how people are using Atlan and what they're doing when they go in there. And if they're not using something that could be particularly helpful to them, then like, reaching out and letting them know that. Another one that I have is the top 10 most used assets. What are the most important assets that we have, and just making sure that those are properly documented, making sure that those are like upkept, and that there's not just one owner for that, but that there are multiple owners for that. So that way we can, make sure that if somebody leaves, it's still taken care of. So those are some things that we decided were important to us. I've got a bunch more, but that's all I'll share for now.
Awesome. And I mean, I think the only one other thing that I would add to that is that we also see people like, we've started thinking about this as almost a concept of like an individual value stream or a problem state, like a single unit of value that you can drive in your users' lives. For example, in this webinar itself, we've talked a ton about ownership. And one of the most repetitive Slack messages that most data teams get is like, who should I talk to about this? And so, as a baseline, we've seen some of our customers actually go in and like just look at baseline Slack messages and say, hey, this is the number of times we get this question every single day or every single week. And then what you could do is like, even just the simple task of having like an owner that's assigned to your assets and making that available itself creates a certain kind of value in your users' lives, right? So you could actually start, one is like, what is that value? And then secondly, you could actually start monitoring your Slack messages or your Jira tickets or things like that to start thinking about like, what value did you drive for that? And so to do that, you do have to get granular. It can't be at a overall, like, we want to build context and trust in our data, right? You have to get granular, which is why exercises like what Emily did with here's our user stakeholder group. This is what they really care about. So let's get down to prioritizing that, and then roll that out and drive value from that is incredibly powerful as you roll this out inside organizations. On that note, given that we're talking about trust, I can actually see a ton of questions about data quality. So I can see, how does Atlan help in data quality? I think there's a question for Harold, which is, do you use any observability tools, and does Atlan interact with that? So we can take that. Do you want to actually just talk about how you think about data quality more broadly than just observability, and then, how you're thinking about that interacting with Atlan? I can jump in on more overall ecosystem context there.
Sure. So for data quality, I think we have more work that we could do on the team, and also being mindful of our budget and what we could introduce, where we could spend our time. We kind of had to prioritize quite aggressively. And for data quality specifically, there's things that are happening in source systems, and there's things that are happening in your transformation layer. And for us, since most of our modeling work on the team is happening in DBT, we're leaning very heavily on DBT tests. And so, that it's gatekeeping, right? But it's not the type of data quality that we're seeing today in the industry. And there's a ton of observability tools being built. There's a ton of open source tools. There's a ton of things that are happening with vendors picking those up. And so I can't share from my experience at WeWork working on that. So I think in this context, it's kind of less relevant, but maybe Prakalpa, you want to talk about Atlan's stance on observability and data quality?
Sure. Yeah. So, I think some of the things that we see in the ecosystem, one of the things we definitely see is that testing is starting to get closer to your data transformation, data pipelining process itself. So we see a ton of teams using DBT tests or something like Great Expectations, which, logically makes a ton of sense, right? Like when you're deploying your data, you should be thinking about some of the tests that go along with that. And so one of the things that we do is we think about, from an Atlan perspective, is how do we bring and surface the output of your data quality tests that are actually already happening in your transformation layer, and make that available alongside your data asset profile, and then start to like propagate things like, hey, if like there was something that broke in a data quality test, can you automatically mark that asset as do not use this today, so that your end business users or your downstream consumers are not going to start using that? Because some of your quality tests and things like that end up, they're pretty siloed still in your data engineering teams and orgs. And so, how do you sort of surface that to your broader organization to build trust? We see a similar kind of use case around observability as well. So where as you think about it, quality testing and observability are two different ways of solving the same problem. Like quality testing, you hopefully get it right when you're building it, but most teams have a ton of things that you have to go back in time and fix. And so that's where observability becomes helpful, right? And so one of the things we see is that if you're using like an anomaly detection kind of tool, you could basically send out those observability alerts into Atlan's asset profile as well, which again then makes that available. So you could auto propagate that through lineage to something like your BI layer and say, hey, if this is a BI dashboard and there's a observability alert or a data quality test failure, just alert your business users that don't use this dashboard today, right? So those are some of the use cases that we see around data quality, and the way Atlan enables data quality. I am just looking through some of the questions here. Harold, Emily, do you want to pick up any ones that you see that you find most interesting?
Oh, there's one that I see about how WeWork handles all the different types of data requests. We have an inject processor tool. It's I think one of it's a very common question for data teams, I feel. And so, how do you prioritize between what your team thinks you should be leading and how do you prioritize between that and what your data products and what your users are asking you to do, right? And how do you switch from being a service-oriented team to a team that's shipping products, and that it lends itself to the team's happiness. And are you feeling that you're constantly dealing with fire drills, or are you building products and shipping them? And I think there's an interesting time allocation exercise that you kind of need to be on top of, right? Like make sure that you allocate whatever percentage of time you have for like a service desk type of thing. I think Atlan powers something similar. I don't think we use that feature in Atlan currently, but that's one thing that maybe Papa can share her perspective on. And then product thinking. Think about your data assets as products, and that includes the things we're talking about right now, like testing and quality, but it also includes product thinking of the intake process and how do you prioritize and what's critical for your team, what's critical for the company, where you're taking a leadership role in building the products and where you're being a bit more reactive to what the business needs you to do.
Makes sense. I can see one around actually how do you guide different user experiences in Atlan from Marissa. Emily, do you want to talk about that? Because I know you did some work around, specific videos that you were launching to the team and pieces like that. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, sure. Different user experiences. So one thing that we're doing right now is we're actually building out collections of queries for different teams. So we're going to different teams. We're asking them, what are the recurring questions that you have? What are the business questions that you have? And saving those queries, writing out those SQL queries and then saving those in there. So that way, when anybody has that question now, they're using the same exact code, they're querying the same exact assets, and so they're all getting the same exact answer. And so we're finding that this is really powerful and useful for teams. Another thing that we do is I try to promote the glossary as a flow that people can go through. So if you really don't know where to start at all, you can search within the glossary, and you can find most words in there. And from there, you can kind of understand more of what it is that you're looking for, and you can see assets that are linked there and try to figure out what it is that that you need. For those that are not great at SQL, we encourage them to use the visual query builder. So once they find their asset from the glossary that they know, and we tell them to look for that verification check. Like, that's important. Make sure that it's verified. You don't want to use one that's got a gray check, because that means it's deprecated. Don't use one that's a work in progress, because it's a work in progress. So encouraging those, giving those visual cues and everything. Those are like the three that we're focusing on right now.
Awesome. Cool.
There's one more question here. I started typing an answer, so I could just answer it out loud. When multiple people try to update a column description, what's the review process there? Some sort of discussion forum integrated where there's a tech reviewer before any update. So within Atlan, you actually can limit permissions for this, and you can only allow certain people to actually edit or create definitions, which is great for governance. And there's also a Slack integration too that everybody can use. So this is how you can have this conversation around this. And then, you can mention people, so that one particular person would get the mention, and they would see it. They can continue the discussion, like actually right within Atlan, and have that discussion right on the page there, or they can like continue it within Slack and everything. But yeah, don't let everybody edit everything. That's chaos. That's where, you'll just get back to where you were, So you do need some rules and regulations around that. Yeah.
Awesome. Makes sense. I can see one, which is, why did you choose Atlan favorite queries instead of Snowflake collections?
Oh, okay. So when you're searching through everything within Snowflake, you have no idea as to whether or not you should be using it. So you don't even know, like from the beginning, if you should be querying it. Atlan can provide those visual indicators with the certificate, like to let you know from the beginning if you're querying what you should be querying or not. And then, the integration just makes it really easy. Also, like using Atlan for querying instead of Snowflake. So previously, what I had mentioned was, we had our documentation within DBT. Documentation is not really within Snowflake. So like having people like have to go to DBT to like learn what it is and then go into Snowflake to query, they can do all of that within Atlan now. They can learn about the asset, they can see the column definitions, they can see the lineage, they can see the description, they can see FAQs, whatever it is that you decide to have within your documentation for this asset, that's all there. And once they have all of that information, they don't have to open another tool now. They can just query right inside of Atlan, and it makes it easier. And again, for those people that aren't great with SQL, there is the visual query builder. And there's also, it starts out the query for you as well. So if you don't know anything, like it has the select star from this asset and it limits it to 50. So if nothing else, like you will get some results. Like it's kind of foolproof in that sense.
And so I want to add on that, right? Like, you need to think about the persona that you're targeting, right? So like if I'm thinking about myself, yeah, I'll go into Snowflake and I'll use SQL because like A, I'm more comfortable in SQL or in code generally, but B, I have context. I know all the different databases. I know different schemas. I know most of the tables. And actually, I don't know most of the tables. I know some of the tables. And I know how to find the metadata within the Snowflake tables and read the column descriptions that are pushed. And so I can find all that, right? But this is me. And that's not necessarily how a business analyst will use our product, right? So kind of think in the mindset of your users.
Awesome. Cool. I know we have 4 minutes left. And so I want to maybe just end with the last question. I can see there are a ton of technical questions about Atlan and what Atlan can do. We've done something called a product showdown. So I'm going to push that to later there, where someone from our solution architect team can answer some of those questions and we'll follow up with them. But while we have Harold and Emily, we have a question from someone who says, we recently onboarded to Atlan. Can you talk about what success looks like? But I actually want to like reframe this a little bit to like, what is the dream that the two of you have with like, what is, like, I know even with like, we're in an ongoing journey here, and like, what is your dream as you think about what your data community should look like, and maybe what Atlan can power there?
Sure. I mean, a dream for like just data culture in general is that like everybody feels included and they don't feel like data is impossible. That would be like a real dream. I want people to feel empowered. I want people to feel like they can do it. I want people to have the tools that they can do it. I think Atlan, the UI is definitely a lot friendlier than Snowflake. Snowflake is like terrifying and intimidating, like for someone like that has never really like looked into data before. So what does success look like? I think success looks like, people that are not on the data team being able to answer like data questions, I think, and like feeling good about the answers that they're given, not being like, I don't know, because I'm not on the data team. Like, I think that's what success looks like.
I think that's a great answer. I want to give a perspective of as a people manager, right? Because there is an aspect in which you're helping your teams not having to deal with, things that they don't like, which is answering all the same questions 110 times on Slack every day, right? Because no one likes to, just repeat the same thing over and over and over again, right? So there's what does it give? How does it unlock your team's time to enable them to focus on the things that they want to focus on and other things that matter for your team? So that's kind of my perspective as, someone who cares about the people who work on the team and kind of how Atlan helps with that.
Those are amazing answers. So at Atlan, internally, we have this, we're a data company, but we actually start every year with something that we call emotional goals of like end of 1 year, like how do we want to feel emotionally? And I feel those are like the best emotional goals that I would, associate. And so thank you for sharing that with us. With that, we actually will come to an end for today's masterclass. Thank you, Harold and Emily, for joining us and being so candid and sharing so many details of your journey, which has been, again, like just calling out like one of the most inspiring journeys that I've seen. And so thank you everyone for joining us. I know it was 90 minutes of your time. I hope it was valuable. We have a feedback form. We want to continue to become better and use data as we do that. So please take a few minutes and answer and give us your feedback. Thank you so much for joining us. I can see there were a bunch of requests on user survey templates and things like that. So feel free to like add in any notes on other things that would be helpful. And we can try and follow up with some of those as resources as follow-ups to today's masterclass. So with that, I think we can close for today. Thank you so much.